Professor of Philosophy and Ethics, and Dr. Peter Jacobson to do the introduction for our speaker tonight. So Justin's going to speak to you a little bit about our PPE major.
I want to start out by just thanking everybody for coming tonight. I had a great time, and I hope everybody who attended also had an interesting time. I love going through those problem cases, and I heard people arguing about them even after we ended, so I always think that's good when people are arguing even after the class ends. I want to talk for a quick second about the PPE major, and then I'll bring up Dr. Peter Jacobson. The PPE major at Ottawa University is philosophy, politics, and economics. And these three subjects are often studied on their own in universities, and I think when this happens, we lose out on some of the kind of cross-pollination that can and ought to occur between these three subjects. So if you're studying economics, you might not only be interested in things like maximizing GDP, but you might also be interested in how moral constraints can restrict which kinds of economic policies that we would want to enact, regardless of what kind of growth might result from them. And similarly, a lot of philosophers talk about things like distributive justice or what counts as a just society, but it's very hard to do that if you don't know the ways in which an economy, being organized will affect the amount of goods that there is to distribute in the first place. And finally, when it comes to politics, it's very hard to do politics without doing things like talking about growth or ethics in general. So to do politics, well, you need to understand both philosophy and economics. And Ottawa is the only university in Kansas that offers the PPE major. The major was developed in England early in the 20th century. It's taught at, I think, 4 Ivy League schools, but we're the only one in Kansas, and we're really proud to offer the PPE major. So if you find yourself at OU, I would love to talk to you about majoring in PPE and what the PPE major can do for you in your careers going forward. And with that, I'll let you get back to your food, and I'm going to bring up Dr. Peter Jacobson. Thank you.
So I have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Rosemarie Fike. Before I introduce her, I wanted to just kind of put things in context. In the 20th century, there was a very influential economist named Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And at the height of his career, one of the things that he realized is that there needed to be a way to measure economic freedom. And so one of the people that he tasked with it, his name was Dr. James Gortney, who is an alum of OU, and he's the namesake of the Gortney Institute. And from my speaking to Jim Gortney, one of his best students was Dr. Rosemarie Fike. Jim's major contribution in economics is this measurement of economic freedom called the Economic Freedom of the World Report. And I would say that out of all the scholars who have contributed that, Dr. Fike has been most instrumental in bringing new important changes to economic freedom measurements. And so it's our distinct honor tonight to have Dr. Fike. She is an instructor of economics at Texas Christian University, and she's a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. She did her master's at George Mason University, and she got her PhD at Florida State University under Jim Gortney. She's been published in lots of academic journals as well as popular outlets like U.S. News and World Report and The Hill. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Rosemarie Fike.
I'm short, so this needs to come down here. Hi, thank you guys for having me. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak at a place where it has so much history for my mentor. So it's really, really nice to be here. Tonight, I want to talk about women's economic freedom and what markets might be able to accomplish for women's lives. And so I want to start by thinking about feminism and capitalism. And so I consider myself to be a feminist. really like markets. And so if you kind of Google image search capitalism and feminism, you're gonna get a lot of images like what you see up here on the screen. There is this sense that capitalism and markets really exploit women. And so when I talk to my friends that consider themselves to be feminists, we get into a lot of interesting arguments because they don't tend to really love markets. And when I talk to a lot of my economist friends, we get into a lot of arguments because they don't tend to prioritize kind of feminist type of goals. So I'm really fun to have at parties. We get into these really interesting conversations with everybody. So I want to kind of set this up by talking about some of the feminist criticisms of markets, and then I want to talk about what markets can achieve for women's lives. Because I have a tendency, spoiler alert, I have a tendency to think that markets are a really essential part of achieving kind of gender equality and feminist goals. And so it's worth pointing these things out. So some of the feminist criticisms of markets, one of the big ones is that markets kind of exploit people, right? That not everybody kind of benefits from markets in the same way. And so there's a really great economist, Nancy Folber, that she has kind of made the argument that in order for markets to function well, it requires women to give their unpaid caring labor. So like capitalism is built on the backs of all the women that stay at home and take care of kids and make lunches for their kids and make, set their husband's clothes out in the morning and, they do all this unpaid caring labor that helps facilitate other people's participation in the market. And so that's a pretty powerful criticism, right? We can talk about, as some of you heard me talk about earlier, markets do improve our living standards, but it's an important question to ask if to what degree do people benefit equally from that kind of process. So, as I said, this is kind of exploitation. Along with that, this idea of exploitation is really goes back to kind of the work of Marx and this idea that the owners of capital kind of profit in a way that exploits exploits workers. Another criticism of markets from a feminist perspective is this idea that markets kind of impose or reinforce gendered preferences. So if you've heard of things called like the pink tax, have you guys ever heard of the pink tax? So the pink tax is this idea that you can go to a store and you see two razors, right? One is black, one is pink. They're identical, but the pink one, the one that's marketed for women, is going to be more expensive. You also see things like, you'll find men's, it's like a shampoo, conditioner, body wash, deodorant all in one, and then for women we have like 80 different products to accomplish those same tasks. So this idea that markets maybe sexualize women or commodify us in a way. So there are really powerful criticisms of markets from a feminist perspective. And one of those criticisms that we hear about a lot are things like the gender pay gap. So I think some of the really excellent high school students today had brought up issues like the gender pay gap when I was talking earlier. And so if anybody knows the gender pay gap, if you don't know what that actually is measuring, it kind of sounds like women and men who are doing the same job are getting different amounts of money for doing the exact same work. And that's not actually what the gender pay gap measures. So the gender pay gap takes the average hourly wage of all working men, no matter what kind of job they're doing, no matter what kind of educational background they have, and no matter what kind of experience they have, lumps it all together and says this is their average hourly wage. And they compare that to the average hourly wage of women who are working, regardless of what job they do, how long they've been doing it, and what their educational background looks like. And so, if it's the case that men and women are making very different choices about what they major in college, and they're making very different choices about what job they decide to do when they graduate college, and then when they start to have families, they're also making very different decisions about who stays in the job market and works for pay, and who stays at home and takes care of the children, then that's gonna do a lot of explaining what drives that gender wage gap. So there's kind of two different ways of looking at the gender pay gap. So I have some of these listed here. U.S. pay gap, U.S. gender pay gap was about 17 cents in 2022. But if you if you control for education, the type of job, and how long people have been in the labor market, so that we're actually comparing apples to apples, that gender pay gap almost entirely disappears. It goes down to a cent or two. So what economists have kind of thought about, what is driving these gender differences in kind of labor market outcomes, as boiling down to our choices, right? And I've given versions of this talk at lots of places, and it's not super sad for people who care about women's rights and women's well-being. It's not typically very satisfying to tell them, well, it's choices. Men and women are making really different choices, and that's why they end up with really different outcomes. But it is. We make different choices about whether or not we want to major in STEM fields or something that's not going to result in a career that has as high of a wage. So our career choices, our human capital attainment, and the length of time that we're in the labor force, these things really matter in terms of determining our wages. So what a lot of economists don't talk about, or a lot of people don't talk about, when we just say choice and leave it at that, we aren't having a larger conversation about what drives those choices, right? Because every choice that we make we're not making decisions in a vacuum, right? We live in a society. Society has rules, both formal rules and informal rules. And those rules, which economists refer to as institutions, those institutions shape the costs and benefits of the choices that we make in really, really important ways. So some of the formal institutions matter, but also one of the things I will talk about towards the end of this is informal institutions like gender norms really, really matter, right? Our expectation about who is going to carry on the responsibility of doing most of those unpaid household caring tasks, who's gonna take care of the kids, who's gonna be the person that has a flexible job so that if a kid gets sick and needs to be picked up from school, that somebody's gonna be able to do that. Who's gonna be the person that helps take care of aging parents and grandparents, right? For most of the world, that type of work falls largely in the domain of women. And so if women are spending more and more of their time doing those things, then it's not terribly surprising that women don't have as outstanding of a labor market performance as men do, because they are constrained in some really important ways. So if we care about women's rights and women's well-being and kind of feminist outcomes, gender equality, some of the standard policy solutions that kind of a modern, typical feminist will talk about are policy solutions like we need government mandated pay equality, or we need government mandated maternity leave, or we need to subsidize child care. And so a lot of the policies Some of them are not as intrusive on people's choices, but we also have policies like quotas for corporate boards. There's like 13 countries in the world that have rules that mandate that a certain percentage of every corporate board has to be composed of women. Right, and that actually restricts a lot of the choices, the freedom of choice that business owners and shareholders have about who they think is actually suited to lead their company. One of the most extreme examples of this is Norway. In Norway, their gender quota is 40%, and it's written in kind of a gender neutral way. So they say at least 40% of your corporate board needs to be represented by the gender that is in the minority. So if at some point that becomes men, then we need to make sure we have 40% of men. And so, so gender quotas, and in Norway, the punishment for that is if your publicly listed company doesn't meet that quota, your company will be delisted from the stock market. You will be, as a pretty strict punishment. Interestingly, when that law went into effect, about 70% of the companies that would have been affected by that law decided to list themselves in the UK stock market or other countries. They either went private or they shifted to where their business was located. So my point in pointing that out is that these types of policy solutions are absolutely restrictions on what we would call economic freedom, right? And so I want to think about why not markets, right? Could economic freedom help us achieve some of the feminist goals that we care about without imposing some of these really severe restrictions on people's ability to choose for themselves in a voluntary way about how to run their own businesses and how to run their own lives? And so institutions, for those of you, some of you, I've talked about this before, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what institutions are. Institutions are just rules that govern how we interact with each other. They can be formal, codified rules that are enforced by a government or another governance structure. So at OU, you guys have a student handbook, I'm sure, and that student handbook dictates things that you should not do. And if you are in violation of some of those things in the student handbook, you might be held accountable in front of disciplinary committees, a formal governing structure to kind of enforce the rules. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the government, but there is a hierarchical structure in place to kind of enforce formal institutions. And informal rules, these are things that we socially enforce, socially police. So if you see somebody littering, right? My parents told me, like, back in the day when they were younger, I think people used to litter all the time. It wasn't like out of character for people to just toss stuff out the window. And today, I can't even imagine, people just driving down the road, just constantly tossing things out the window. My husband, he was driving in Fort Worth a couple of months ago, and he had the windows down, because it's still so hot in Texas. He had the windows down, and in the back of his car, he had like a shopping bag. And you know how sometimes there gets like a wind tunnel in your car, kind of sucked the shopping bag right out the window. He did not toss the bag out of the window, but it got sucked out the window. And there was a car full of ladies that pulled up next to him and just started yelling at him at the red light, like, how dare you? That is social enforcement of the rules, giving dirty looks, right? Not inviting people to the party because they violated some sort of rule. This is social enforcement. And so part of what I'm going to talk about today are formal rules, but the other part are informal rules. Gender norms are informal rules. Like when a woman gets a dirty look or comments or snickers when they are doing something that is not characteristic of a woman to do, right? That is society trying to raise the cost of challenging gender norms. So, there's been a lot written in economics about the importance of institutions for economic development. So one of my favorite quotes from economist Adam Smith says, "Little else is requisite to raise a country from the highest to the highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." That is a statement about institutions. That is a statement about institutional context. What are the rules that govern our interactions with each other? We need peace, we need protection from, somebody hurting you, physically violent, being violent, and from stealing your property. We need easy taxes, because if taxes are too high, people aren't gonna wanna be productive. We need a tolerable administration of justice. We need rule of law, right? We need rules to be enforced in an even-handed, very predictable way. Because it's really, if the court system does not resolve contract disputes in a very predictable way, that kind of increases the uncertainty involved in running business and engaging in contracts with people. So institutions matter. I won't read some of these other quotes, but the main point of all three of them is that institutions matter for economic growth and development. But I also think they matter for women's lives. I think economic rights, economic institutions, economic freedom specifically, is a necessary ingredient to achieving feminist goals or gender equality, or better outcomes for women, just in general. So there's many reasons why economic institutions like economic freedom are important. First and foremost, like a hallmark of economic freedom is that you can choose for yourself how to spend your time, who you want to interact with, who you want to trade with. You could say, no, I don't want to do that job. I don't want to sell this to a particular customer. We can say no, we can say yes. It gives you control over how you spend your time and how you live your life. That in and of itself is a really important thing, having control over your own choices. It also facilitates social cooperation. When we have trade and division of labor, just everything we are producing and consuming takes the vast network of cooperation of countless people. So just think about the things that are in front of you right now, maybe the phone that you have in your pocket. How many people had to cooperate to make that phone? It takes the cooperation of countless people across many different countries to all collaborate on the production of the things that we use every single day. So it facilitates cooperation, and it ties your interest to the interest of other people. One of the things that I often joke with my students about is, do you ever think we would invade Canada? That just sounds absolutely ludicrous for the United States to get into a military conflict with Canada. One of the reasons why that's an absolutely ludicrous idea is Canada's our biggest trading partner, right? You might think it's China. No, Canada and Mexico are our biggest trading partners. And it would be absolutely ridiculous for us to get into a conflict with Canada or Mexico, because we would be shooting ourselves in the foot, right? We depend on them so much for so many goods and services. Our businesses benefit from their business, and it would be detrimental. So it kind of creates peace, it ties our fates together. It also gives us the luxury to ask and think about moral or ethical questions. Because markets raise our living standards, it's really hard to care about things like the environment or gender equality or racial equality when you are starving, right? Once you have higher living standards, you can start to think about things beyond survival, and you can start to think about bigger moral, ethical questions. I'll leave it at that for this long list of benefits, but the one thing that I kind of want to mention towards the bottom, Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker, he did a lot of work to talk about markets and how market competition actually punishes discrimination. Because when you discriminate against people for whatever reason, you actually have to pay a premium for that discrimination. So why did he say this? Let's suppose we live in a sexist society, and in that sexist society, for whatever reason, employers have a preference for hiring men over women. And because they have a preference for hiring men over women, men are gonna be more expensive to hire because the demand for male labor will be much higher than the demand for female labor. And so we should have higher wages. So if I'm trying to make a profit, and I notice that kind of the talent pool of women looks kind of similar to the talent pool of men, but I can hire women at a lower wage rate. If I do that, now my labor costs are cheaper. Now I can offer my product at a lower price, and I'm now out competing my competition. And if my competition wants to kind of keep up with me and lower their costs so that they can offer lower prices, they're gonna also have to start hiring women, whether they want to or not. And as more and more firms start to hire women, that's gonna push their wages up because that's gonna increase the demand for labor, and that can kind of cause their wages to become more equal over time. So Becker's work really focused on racial discrimination, but we can apply that idea to gender discrimination as well and other types of discrimination. The last point here is, I love bringing this up, it's Montesquieu's du commerce thesis. It's this idea that when we participate in markets, we are trading not just goods and services, but we're trading bits and pieces of culture. It's also this idea that when you are operating in a market, you have to practice certain types of virtues. In order to be a successful business owner, you have to keep your promises, right? You have to be on time. You have to, if you're running a business and you don't want to drive your customers away, you kind of have to temper what you say, right? I would never want to go to a hairdresser who likes to spout conspiracy theories and talk about offensive political opinions, because I would just be like, this is very awkward and I have to sit here for a long time, I'm never going back, right? People temper their extreme positions in order to maintain a customer base. And so through practicing commercial behaviors, we start to become a bit more tolerant of other people's differences. So yeah, that's Montesquieu. So, all right. There's been a lot of work on the impact of economic freedom on various development outcomes. There's been tons of work done showing that economic freedom actually causes countries to grow faster. It causes living standards to rise. My work has largely focused on looking at women's lives and their status across countries based on the level of economic freedom. And I'll show you some of that data tonight, but women tend to have better development outcomes in places that are economically free. Economic freedom has also been associated with being, attitudes that are less materialistic. So people who are living in economically free countries do not have as much of a tendency to prioritize just making, contrary to what critics of markets say, but we do not have as much of a tendency to prioritize these material outcomes as people who don't live in economically free countries. That might just be because when you're not living in an economically free country, you're pretty poor, and so making more money and focusing on material things is actually kind of going to be the only thing that you focus on. Economic freedom has been shown to facilitate social trust. It has been shown to increase tolerance. So this particular paper that I cite here by Nicholas Berggren, it's looking at tolerance towards people with different sexual preferences than you. So people are more tolerant of neighbors that might have a different preference than they have. It also lowers corruption, and it sustains other types of human rights. So economic rights sustain other types of rights like political rights or civil liberties. So there's this thesis in economics called the Hayek-Friedman the hypothesis is that you can have a country that is economically free but not politically free, right? We can think of examples like Hong Kong and Singapore. They don't have political freedom, but they have a lot of economic freedom. But what you can never find an example of is the opposite. A country that has political freedom and civil liberties without economic freedom. You can't find an example of that. So economic freedom allows us to sustain some of these other human rights. If you're interested, the Cato Institute has a wonderful publication called the Human Freedom Index, where they kind of explore some of these things. So I've got 2 hypotheses that I'm working with. I like to always talk about 2 hypotheses in my presentations. So I think women living in economically free societies are gonna have better development outcomes. So they're gonna be thriving in a way that women in unfree societies aren't thriving. I also think, and this is what we'll talk about at the last part of this, that women in economically free societies are gonna have gender norms that are less likely to prioritize men over women in things like job opportunities, educational opportunities, and political leadership opportunities. So for those of you who were not at my earlier discussion today, the hallmarks of economic freedom are personal choice, voluntary exchange, the freedom to enter a market and compete, the ability to have your property protected in a way where you're not constantly having to defend it yourself, protection of your physical safety as well. And so these are, to me, economic freedom, it doesn't give you equality of opportunity. One of my favorite economists, Deirdre McCloskey, I heard her give a talk a year ago, and she was like, I hate this equality of opportunity. We should talk about it as equality of permission, not equality of opportunity. Because if you live in an economically free society, there's still a lot of differences in kind of the families that we're born into. You could be born into a wealthy family or born to a poor family. You're not gonna have the same opportunities, but what you do have is the same permission to go and try out your ideas. Right? Equality of permission is what you have. And you have more control over how you spend your time, who you spend it with, what type of career you pursue. We measure economic freedom from a negative rights perspective in the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And so what that means is we're measuring freedom from other people. You're protected from other people stopping you from making choices. You're free from other people stealing from you, hurting you. That is in contrast to positive freedoms. A lot of times you might hear people say we have a right to an education, or one of the economists that I had mentioned earlier, Nancy Fulber, and a colleague or a co-author of hers occasionally, Martha Nussbaum, they talk about people not being free unless they have access to things like education and healthcare. That's a positive right. That's not the kind of rights that I'm talking about when I say economic freedom, right? Positive rights are more of entitlements, right? If you have a right to an education, that actually requires us to limit people's economic freedom by taxing them and taking away some of their property in order to provide that. Now, we as a society might want that. We might make that trade-off. We might say that that's something that we desire. But I want to be clear when I talk about economic freedom of the world and how it's measured, I'm not talking about positive rights. I'm talking about these negative rights, these kind of property rights, individual rights. So there's 5 different components to economic freedom. The first one is the size of government relative to the economy. It really just tells us how big of a player the state is in the market. So how high are your taxes? How much, are there lots of state-owned enterprises? To what degree is the state a big player in the market? The second one, rule of law and property rights, it's kind of in the name, right? To what degree are property rights protected and enforced? To what degree are people treated equally under the law? Because if there's one set of rules for one group of people and a different set of rules for another group of people, then we do not have rule of law, right? We have something else. Sound money is important, so this is referring to monetary policy and the ability to keep prices stable and predictable, which is important for contracting purposes and to facilitate long-term exchanges. The freedom to trade internationally so that we can take advantage of our comparative advantages and specialize in what we're actually good at producing. And so we can collaborate with people, we can focus on what we're good at and trade for the things that we're not so good at. And the last area that is included is the regulation of labor and business. So regulations they add to the cost of doing business. So for whatever social reasons we may want those regulations, we still have to acknowledge that it does add to the cost of doing business as we have to allocate resources to enforcing those regulations. It also makes it kind of hard to pursue some of your entrepreneurial ideas. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was occupational licensing, and in the United States, it used to be the case that maybe about 5% of jobs required a license. Now it's upwards of, I think, a third, 25 to 30% of occupations in the US require a license. So if you ask yourself, why does income mobility not look the way it used to? Well, one of the reasons is it's really hard to do some of the jobs that might allow you to move to a higher income bracket. So in my work with the Economic Freedom of the World Index, I've created what I call the Gender Disparity Index. And so I take some data from the World Bank that looks at specifically, are there rules in place that limit what women can do but don't add that barrier for men? So basically, are there laws that add additional barriers to women's economic rights in a way that men don't have to contend with? And if there is, then we need to give an adjustment to how economically free we think certain countries are. Because if you have low tax rates and well-protected property rights and not a lot of labor regulation, but women can't own property and they can't open a bank account and they're not allowed to work, then really only 50% of your population is economically free. The other 50% is not. And so we need to account for that, and that is what my work has done. And so I use that measure of gender disparity to give an adjustment to the rule of law area. Because as I said, rule of law, if people are being treated the same under the same set of rules, we have rule of law. If women don't have the same economic rights that men have, then we need to downward adjust the rule of law score. So here's some of the questions that I include these are all, the entire set of 17 questions I include in my gender disparity index, and it's things like, do women have the same freedom of mobility? So can they get a passport in the same way? Can they choose where to live in the same way that a man can? Can they move around freely, both outside of the country and within the country? Or do they need an adult male escort when they leave their house? Can they open a business? Can they open a bank account? There are several countries in the world where women can't open a bank account. There's a lot of countries in the world where women can't own property or they can't inherit property in the same way that men can. There's over 100 countries in the world that have some labor market restriction that is gendered. So, when we think about restrictions on women's rights, we might kind of jump towards certain regions of the world. And I will show you, right, a lot of these very severe restrictions are taking place in Middle East, North Africa, and Southeastern Asian countries. But Latin America and Eastern Europe have lots of labor market restrictions on the type of work that women can do. There are laws that say that women can't work at night. There are laws that say that women can't work in dangerous jobs. There are laws that say that women can't work in a job that requires heavy lifting. Belarus, for example, has a law in place where women cannot work with pesticides at all. Now, do I want to open a pest control business? Not particularly. And maybe there aren't that many women who want to open a pest control business, but there might be some women for whom that is their best opportunity to improve their lives. And you're taking it off the table for them. And so, to me, I want you to imagine a woman, imagine you are a woman in a very, very bad relationship, right? Worst thing that you can think of. You're married to somebody who's physically violent, financially controlling, emotionally abusive. If you live in a country like the United States, where women do have economic rights, you might get a job, and you don't need your husband's permission for that. You can get a job. You can open up a bank account that they don't know about. You can start saving money. And when you're ready, you can freely move outside of that house and go somewhere else without an escort, without your husband's permission. But in a place where you don't have any economic rights, how do you escape a bad situation like that? Right? You need to ask your husband's permission to work, and if he's very abusive, he's not going to give you permission to work. So there is no ability to escape a really bad situation in the absence of economic freedom. Or let me rephrase that. It's a heck of a lot easier to escape a bad situation if you have economic freedom. And so this is why I say it's an essential right. It's an essential step for women to flourish. It can be a life raft for certain people. So good news is there's 62 countries in the world where men and women have the same level of rights. These 62 countries, men and women are treated equally under the law. Okay. They're not necessarily super free, but they're treated equally under the law. Let me get to some of the juicy stuff. All right. Economic freedom for women, on average, has increased dramatically. Even during COVID, where regular economic freedom plummeted, there's still an upward trend. So things are getting more equal for women over time. Even in places like Saudi Arabia and UAE, they have made significant reforms to give women economic rights. And that has resulted in a lot of improvement in their outcomes. So let me look at some of the labor market outcomes. So the blue lines are men's data, the pink lines are women's data, because I listen to gender norms, and that's the men's color and that's the women's color according to the gender norms. Labor market participation is a lot higher for women in economically free countries. It is higher for men in economically free countries too, but if you notice, the gap between men and women's labor market participation gets much more narrow as we go from least free countries to the most free countries. So it seems to matter more for women than for men. The employment to population ratio is also higher. That's just another way of looking at kind of the labor market participation. The unemployment rates for women and men living in economically free countries are a lot lower. I put both the data from 2020 and 2019 because 2020 was a very weird year, so we can't really look at the trend. We can't really trust that trend in the way that we can trust other years. So 2019, right, the gap between men and women's unemployment rates also narrows as we go from least free to most free. This also holds for people who are in the labor force that have higher levels of education. So we have more labor that has advanced education, so college degrees, and of the people who have advanced education, they have a much lower rate of unemployment. So people who have invested in building their human capital, they are able to find jobs to a better degree in economically free countries. And again, the gap between men and women's outcome narrows as we get to economically free countries. Oops. Let's see. I love this one, account ownership at a financial institution. Women are significantly more likely to have a bank account in economically free countries, right? Over 80% of them have one, whereas less than a third have them in the economically unfree countries. So some semblance of financial independence. They're also going to be healthier. Their life expectancy is higher. Their lifetime risk of dying from childbirth or childbirth-related causes is significantly lower. So one of the most dangerous things a woman can do is give birth. That is still true, but it's a lot safer in economically free countries. Child mortality rates and infant mortality rates are significantly lower. So if we care about our children, they are healthier in economically free countries. Preventable deaths, right? Deaths from communicable diseases and preventable causes like nutritional deficiencies, those are a lot lower. And adolescent fertility rates are significantly lower in economically free countries. That makes sense. If I have economic opportunity, I'm gonna be a lot less likely to, the opportunity cost of having a baby at a young age is a lot higher. We're also gonna be more educated, right? We're gonna complete primary school at a higher rate. We're gonna complete secondary school at a higher rate. We're gonna have higher rates of college education as well. So we're gonna have more of a stock of human capital that makes our labor force more effective. So last, I'm gonna turn to gender norms. So I'm gonna kind of skip over this because gender norms do matter. And so I look at some data from the World Value Survey, and I look at 3 specific questions. There's 3 questions that people get asked. When times are tough, are jobs more important for men than women? And if people strongly agree with that, then that's kind of a sign that that society is going to prioritize men over women in the labor market. On the whole, the men make better political leaders than women, and university is more important for a boy than for a girl. So if most people in society strongly agree with those things, then that kind of captures cultural attitudes that say men should take priority in these positions, women don't have as much of a room to get into these positions. And what I find, if you look at my little bar chart, the higher number is better. So economically free countries have more tolerant gender norms. They are less likely to prioritize men over women in those 3 areas. And if I do some fancy econometrics where I control for political institutions and civil liberties and some other factors that might matter, economic freedom has a significant impact on, or it's statistically significant in terms of its effect on gender norms. So it seems to make us more tolerant of women entering spaces that are not traditionally thought of as women's roles. So that's really all I have. If you are interested in learning more about this work that I do, there's a couple of additional resources for you. There's a really great website that the Fraser Institute put together. It's womenandprogress.org. That really shows a lot of this research. So thank you guys so much for listening, and it was really nice interacting with you guys today.
All right. Oh shoot! Can you, Justin, grab me that cup of tickets there? I got a couple $50 Walmart cards to see who the matter. Why don't you pick one? I'll hold it, I guess. Make sure I'm not biased. How about 1992? 1992. Gotta be present to win. Maybe there's. Oh, 1992. All right. Hey, congratulations. All right, one more $50 card. 2056, the last 4 digits of my cell phone number. Maybe it's me. No, it's not. I'm not even gonna. 2056, 2056. Going once, 2056, going to. All right, there might be a few in here that we didn't have. because my GAs didn't separate. 2046. Oh, Louise! There you go, congratulations. All right, so we're going to come to a close then with our raffles and other things, and let's give another round of applause for Dr. Fike. So one of our surprises that I should have had Kevin come up and grab those certificates. So we have some scholarships available for our high school participants. So on the certificate here is your name, and we're going to want to get a picture at the end. But yeah, grab that whole tray. There we go. All right. So everybody's going to get one of these, and we'll dismiss you guys so that we don't keep you guys too much longer. But this thing says the Courtney Institute PPE League Academic Scholarship valued at nearly $74,000 over the course of the 4 years. So we have a scholarship for you. Now you might be able to get scholarships in other ways with some other academics or other events. But this represents a cut of our tuition. We are a private school, so you maybe heard it's not cheap to go here, but we try to help out in different ways, and we'd love you to be a part of Ottawa University. So you'll each be receiving one of these certificates with your name on it, and if you want to learn more about Ottawa and what that means, we have people from our financial aid office and admissions office to kind of talk to you more about that. So congratulations for spending the day with us, and we appreciate you being here. And so for the high school students, so undergrads, you guys are dismissed at will whenever you want. And high school students, we have your exit survey. So once you finish the exit survey, Kevin, how are we gonna do? You got oh, it's up there, okay. So the exit survey, so you guys do that, and then come and see me, and like we talked about, I've got some bills here. So come on up.